The grand ballroom of Ravencrest Palace sparkled under 1,000 crystal chandeliers as nobles from across the kingdom gathered for Queen Katrin's birthday celebration. Lady Corinna adjusted her emerald silk gown nervously, her eyes scanning the crowd for her 16-year-old son, Prince Adrian. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that tonight would mark Adrian's first formal presentation to the Queen since his father's death 6 months ago. Queen Katrin, resplendent in royal blue velvet adorned with diamonds, sat upon her golden throne at the far end of the ballroom. Her piercing green eyes surveyed the assembled guests with the calculating gaze of a monarch who had ruled for 23 years. Every noble in the room understood the unspoken rules of court protocol, especially the sacred tradition of bowing before the Queen during formal presentations. Lady Corinna spotted Adrian near the marble columns, his dark hair catching the light as he spoke animatedly with his childhood friend, Lord Marcus. Even from a distance, she could see the defiant set of his shoulders, the way he held his head high with the pride that had both blessed and cursed the men in their family for generations. His father, Duke Edmund, had possessed the same stubborn streak, though he had always known when to bend for the sake of survival. The herald's voice boomed across the ballroom, announcing the beginning of the formal presentations. Lady Corinna's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched noble after noble approach the throne, executing perfect bows and curtsies before receiving the Queen's acknowledgement. Each presentation followed the same choreographed pattern that had been observed for centuries, a dance of power and submission that maintained the delicate balance of the royal court. When Adrian's name was called, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Lady Corinna held her breath as her son strode confidently across the polished marble floor, his black velvet jacket and silver threading marking him as one of the highest-ranking nobles in the kingdom. Every eye in the room followed his progress, whispers rippling through the crowd like waves on a disturbed pond. Adrian stopped precisely 3 feet from the throne, just as protocol demanded. Queen Katrin leaned forward slightly, her jeweled crown catching the light as she prepared to receive his bow. The moment stretched on, heavy with expectation, as the entire ballroom waited for the young prince to fulfill his duty. But instead of bending his knee or lowering his head, Adrian stood perfectly straight, his blue eyes meeting the Queen's gaze with unwavering directness. The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Corinna felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was happening. Her son, her precious boy who carried the weight of their family's legacy on his young shoulders, was openly defying the Queen in front of the entire court. The whispers that had been soft murmurs moments before now grew into audible gasps of shock and disbelief. Queen Katrin's expression remained carefully neutral, but Lady Corinna knew the monarch well enough to recognize the flash of fury that crossed her features. The Queen's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the arms of her throne, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. This was not merely a breach of etiquette. It was a public challenge to her authority that could not go unanswered. Captain Garrett of the Royal Guard took a step forward from his position beside the throne, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. The captain was a man of few words but decisive action, known throughout the kingdom for his unwavering loyalty to the crown. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his dark eyes were fixed on Adrian. With the intensity of a predator assessing a threat, Adrian seemed completely unaware of the storm he had unleashed. He continued to stand tall, his chin raised defiantly, as if he were making some noble statement rather than committing what many would consider an act of treason. Lady Corinna could see the pain in her son's eyes, the grief that had consumed him since his father's death. But she also recognized the dangerous pride that threatened to destroy everything their family had built over generations. The tension in the ballroom was suffocating. Nobles shifted uncomfortably in their positions, uncertain whether they should intervene or bear witness to what might become a tragedy. Some of the older courtiers remembered similar incidents from years past, moments when pride had led to exile, imprisonment, or worse. The unwritten rules of court were clear. Those who challenged the Queen's authority rarely lived to regret their decision. Queen Katrin's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. each word carefully measured and deadly calm. "Prince Adrian," she said, her tone betraying nothing of the rage that Lady Corinna knew must be burning beneath the surface. "Perhaps you have forgotten the customs of our court during your time of mourning." Adrian's jaw tightened, and Lady Corinna felt her heart break as she recognized the same expression her late husband had worn during their most heated arguments. "Your Majesty," Adrian replied, his young voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, "I have forgotten nothing. I simply choose not to bow to the woman who destroyed my father." The gasps that followed were audible throughout the vast chamber. Several ladies pressed their fans to their lips in shock, while the male courtiers exchanged worried glances. Lady Corinna closed her eyes momentarily, knowing that her son had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, poisoning the festive atmosphere with its bitter truth. Captain Garrett moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior, stepping between Adrian and the Queen with his hand now fully resting on his sword hilt. The captain's presence filled the space with an aura of barely contained violence, his loyalty to the crown absolute and unwavering. Behind him, 3 more guards moved into position, their armor clanking softly as they formed a protective barrier around the throne. "The accusation borders on treason, young prince." Captain Garrett's voice was low and dangerous, his words meant for Adrian alone, but carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet of the ballroom. "I suggest you reconsider your words before they lead you down a path you cannot escape." Adrian turned his attention to the captain, his blue eyes blazing with the passionate intensity of youth and grief. "Treason?" He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unnatural in the elegant surroundings. "My father served this crown faithfully for 30 years. He led armies, negotiated treaties, and gave everything for this kingdom. And when he dared to question one of Her Majesty's decisions, she stripped him of his titles and sent him into exile." Lady Corinna remembered that terrible day 6 months ago when Duke Edmund had been summoned to court for what they thought would be a routine council meeting. Instead, he had returned home pale and shaken, carrying a royal decree that banished him from court and revoked his position as the Queen's chief advisor. The official reason given was conduct unbecoming of a noble, but everyone knew the real cause was his opposition to the Queen's plan to increase taxes on the common people during the harsh winter. Queen Katrin rose slowly from her throne, her movements deliberate and regal despite the fury that Lady Corinna could see building in her eyes. The Queen's voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your father was exiled because he chose rebellion over loyalty. He spread dissent among my council and questioned my judgment in front of foreign ambassadors. Such behavior cannot be tolerated, regardless of past service." "He died of a broken heart," Adrian shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. 3 months after you cast him out like a common criminal, his heart gave out because he could not bear the shame of your betrayal. So no, Your Majesty, I will not bow to you. I will not pretend that you deserve my respect or my family's submission." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of silk gowns as nobles shifted nervously. Lady Corinna felt tears burning, her eyes as she watched her son destroy his future with words that she knew came from a place of pure pain. She understood his grief, shared his anger. But she also knew that this confrontation would end in disaster for their entire family. Captain Garrett's sword moved an inch from its sheath, the soft ring of steel against leather serving as a warning that echoed through the chamber. "You will show proper respect to your queen, or you will face the consequences of your defiance," he stated flatly. His professional calm more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been. Adrian stepped closer to the captain, his youth and inexperience evident in the reckless way he moved within striking distance of an armed warrior. "What consequences?" he demanded. "Will you exile me as well? Strip away what little my family has left? Or perhaps you plan something more permanent, like the accidents that sometimes befall troublesome nobles who disappear on hunting trips?" Lady Corinna gasped, recognizing the reference to Duke Aldrich, a former rival of the Queen who had indeed vanished during a royal hunt 3 years earlier. Such accusations were whispered in private chambers but never spoken aloud, especially not in the Queen's presence. Her son was no longer merely expressing grief. He was making accusations that could justify immediate execution under royal law. The mention of Duke Aldrich's mysterious disappearance sent a visible shudder through the assembled nobles. Lady Corinna watched in horror as Queen Katrin's face transformed from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. The Queen's green eyes glittered with a cold fury that reminded everyone present why she had maintained her grip on power for over 2 decades through wars, rebellions, and countless political challenges. "Captain Garrett," the Queen's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the vast ballroom. "Arrest Prince Adrian for treason against the crown." His words have crossed beyond mere disrespect into open sedition. The command fell like a hammer blow. Final and irrevocable, Lady Corinna felt her knees weaken as she watched Captain Garrett draw his sword with practiced efficiency. The blade gleamed in the chandelier light, its edge sharp enough to end her son's life with a single stroke. Around the ballroom, nobles pressed back against the walls, creating a clear circle around the unfolding drama, while simultaneously distancing themselves from what everyone understood could be a family-destroying scandal. "No!" Lady Corinna's voice rang out as she broke from her position near the marble columns, her emerald gown trailing behind her as she rushed toward the throne. Years of court training fell away as maternal instinct took control, driving her to place herself between her son and the armed guards. "Your Majesty, please, he is just a boy consumed by grief." His words come from pain, not rebellion. Queen Katrin's gaze shifted to Lady Corinna with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting prey. "Lady Corinna, you will step aside immediately, or you will join your son in facing charges of treason. I will not tolerate interference in matters of royal justice." But Lady Corinna had already made her choice the moment she saw her son in danger. She moved to stand beside Adrian, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she addressed the Queen. "Your Majesty, my son speaks from a broken heart. His father's death has left him angry and confused, but he poses no real threat to your reign. Surely mercy would better serve the crown than executing a grieving child." Adrian looked at his mother with surprise and gratitude, though his stubborn pride remained evident in the set of his shoulders. "Mother, you should not risk yourself for my mistakes," he said quietly. But his voice carried clearly in the tense silence of the ballroom. Captain Garrett paused, his sword still drawn but his advance halted by Lady Corinna's intervention. The captain's weathered face showed no emotion, but those who knew him well could see the slight hesitation in his stance. He had served at court long enough to witness many such family tragedies, and despite his unwavering loyalty to the Queen, he was not immune to the human cost of royal justice. "Your son has accused me of murder," Queen Katrin said, her voice rising slightly as she gestured toward the assembled nobles. "He has spoken of betrayal and implied that I am responsible for his father's death. These are not the words of a grieving child, Lady Corinna. They are the calculated accusations of a young man who seeks to undermine my authority." The truth in the Queen's words cut deep, because Lady Corinna knew that Adrian's accusations, while born from grief, were not entirely without foundation. Duke Edmund had indeed died of a heart attack, but the stress of his exile and the shame of losing the Queen's favor had undoubtedly contributed to his declining health. Her son was not entirely wrong, but being right did not make his public challenge any less dangerous. Lord Marcus, Adrian's childhood friend, stepped forward from the crowd with the cautious movements of someone walking through a minefield. His young face was pale but determined as he addressed the Queen. "Your Majesty, if I may speak on behalf of my friend, Prince Adrian has been like a brother to me since childhood, and I can attest that he has never shown any signs of rebellious intent before tonight. His grief has been overwhelming since Duke Edmund's passing." Several other young nobles began to murmur their agreement, creating a low buzz of sympathy that rippled through the ballroom. Lady Corinna felt a flicker of hope as she realized that her son's friends and allies were willing to risk the Queen's displeasure to speak in his defense. The solidarity of the younger generation was both touching and terrifying. as it threatened to turn this personal tragedy into a broader political crisis. Queen. Katrin's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the growing unrest among her nobles. She had ruled long enough to recognize the early signs of faction building and political opposition. What had begun as one young man's grief-fueled outburst was threatening to become something much larger and more dangerous to her reign. Captain Garrett stepped closer to the Queen, speaking in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your Majesty, perhaps a public execution would create a martyr?" The boy's friends clearly see him as a tragic figure rather than a traitor. There might be wisdom in finding another solution that maintains your authority while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Queen Katrin considered Captain Garrett's whispered counsel while her penetrating gaze swept across the assembled nobles. She could see the tension in their faces, the way the younger courtiers had begun to cluster together in subtle shows of solidarity with Adrian. 23 years on the throne had taught her to read the political currents of her court like a sailor reads the wind, and she recognized the dangerous shift occurring in the ballroom. "Very well," the Queen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her every word obeyed without question. "Prince Adrian, you will have one opportunity to redeem yourself and spare your family further disgrace. You will publicly apologize for your accusations, bow properly before your queen, and accept whatever punishment I deem appropriate for your disrespect." Lady Corinna felt her heart skip as she realized the Queen was offering her son a way out of the deadly trap he had created. It was not mercy, exactly, but it was survival wrapped in the language of royal justice. She turned to Adrian with pleading eyes, silently begging him to accept the lifeline being offered, regardless of how it might wound his pride. But Adrian's response shattered her hopes like crystal hitting stone. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth," he said, his young voice carrying across the ballroom with devastating clarity. "My father was the most honorable man in this kingdom, and I will not dishonor his memory by bowing to the woman who broke his heart and hastened his death." The collective intake of breath from the assembled nobles was audible, and Lady Corinna felt the world spinning around her as she watched her son choose principle over survival. She understood his pain, shared his anger at the injustices they had suffered, but she also knew that this path led only to destruction for their entire family. Captain Garrett's expression hardened as he realized the negotiations had failed. His sword rose slightly, the point now directed at Adrian's chest with professional precision. "Then you have chosen your fate, young prince. The Queen has offered you mercy, and you have spurned it. There can be no further appeals? Wait." The voice came from an unexpected source as Lady Beatrice, the Queen's younger sister, stepped forward from her position near the royal dais. The princess had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but now she moved with the confidence of someone who had watched royal politics from the shadows for decades. Her intervention surprised everyone, including the Queen herself. "Sister," Lady Beatrice said, addressing Queen Katrin directly while maintaining the formal protocol required in public, "perhaps we should consider the broader implications of tonight's events. This young man's grief has clearly overcome his judgment, but executing him here would send a message that your reign rests on fear rather than justice." Queen Katrin's eyes flashed with annoyance at being challenged by her own sister in front of the court. The relationship between the royal siblings had always been complicated, with Lady Beatrice often serving as the conscience that Queen Katrin sometimes found inconvenient. "Princess Beatrice, this is a matter of royal law and justice. The boy has committed treason in front of witnesses. He has committed the crime of loving his father too much," Lady Beatrice replied gently, her words carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived through many such palace dramas. Yes, his words were inappropriate and disrespectful, but they came from a place of genuine grief, not political ambition. Perhaps there is a way to address his offense while acknowledging the humanity of his pain. Lady Corinna found herself holding her breath as she watched the royal sisters engage in what amounted to a public debate about her son's fate. She had always respected Lady Beatrice's reputation for compassion and wisdom, but she had never imagined that the princess would risk her own position to defend a rebellious young noble. Adrian looked confused by the unexpected support from Lady Beatrice. his defiant stance wavering slightly as he tried to understand the political currents swirling around him. His youth and grief had blinded him to the complexity of palace politics, leaving him unprepared for the consequences of his public challenge to the Queen's authority. Lord Marcus and several other young nobles moved closer to Adrian, their silent support creating a protective circle that reminded everyone present of the loyalty that the late Duke Edmund had inspired among the younger generation. The visual was powerful and potentially dangerous, suggesting a generational divide that could threaten the stability of the court. Captain Garrett maintained his ready position, his sword still drawn but his advance halted by the royal family's debate. Years of faithful service had taught him to wait for clear orders, even when those orders were delayed by political considerations that extended beyond his military expertise. Queen Katrin surveyed the scene before her with calculating eyes, weighing the immediate satisfaction of crushing a rebellious subject against the long-term political costs of creating a martyr. She could see how the story would be told in the years to come. A grieving young man executed for loving his father too much, a queen who chose fear over mercy when faced with honest emotion. The weight of royal decision pressed down on Queen Katrin's shoulders as she studied the faces surrounding her. She could see the fear in Lady Corinna's eyes, the stubborn pride still blazing in Adrian's gaze, and the quiet hope that had begun to flicker among the younger nobles who believed mercy might yet prevail. But she also understood that her response would define how she was remembered by history and how her authority would be perceived by future generations. Captain Garrett, lower your sword, the Queen commanded, her voice carrying a note of reluctant decision. The relief that swept through the ballroom was palpable, though everyone understood that the crisis was far from resolved. Prince Adrian, while I will not accept your treasonous accusations, I acknowledge that grief can drive even good men to madness. Adrian's shoulders sagged slightly as the immediate threat of death receded, but his expression remained defiant. Lady Corinna felt tears of gratitude burning her eyes as she realized her son would live to see another day, though she knew the Queen's mercy would come with a price that might prove nearly as devastating as execution. However, Queen Katrin continued, her voice regaining its edge of steel, disrespect to the crown cannot go unpunished, regardless of its motivation. You have publicly challenged my authority, made accusations of murder, and refused to show proper deference to your sovereign. These actions demand consequences. Lady Beatrice stepped closer to her sister, her gentle voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. What consequences do you propose, Your Majesty? Surely something that teaches humility while preserving the future of a noble family that has served the crown for generations. The Queen's green eyes glittered as she considered her options, weighing justice against political wisdom. Prince Adrian, you will be stripped of your title and holdings, effective immediately. Your family's estates will be held in trust by the crown until such time as you demonstrate genuine repentance and loyalty. You will serve in the royal army as a common soldier for a period of no less than 3 years. The punishment was severe but not fatal, and Lady Corinna felt a complex mixture of relief and despair wash over her. Her son would live, but their family's ancient legacy would be suspended, their wealth and status reduced to nothing until Adrian proved himself worthy of restoration. It was exile without leaving the kingdom, humiliation wrapped in the language of second chances. Adrian's face went pale as he absorbed the magnitude of his punishment. Losing his title meant losing his identity, his place in society, and his future as he had always imagined it. Serving as a common soldier would subject him to hardships he had never experienced, commanded by men who would take pleasure in humbling a fallen prince. Furthermore, the Queen continued, her voice growing colder as she delivered the final blow, Lady Corinna, your family's position at court is hereby suspended indefinitely. You will retire to your countryside estate and remain there until your son has completed his service and demonstrated his worthiness to return to royal favor. The additional punishment struck Lady Corinna like a physical blow. Not only was her son being cast down, but she too was being exiled from the life she had known since childhood. The court had been her world, her friends, her purpose. And now it was being stripped away as collateral damage for Adrian's pride. Captain Garrett sheathed his sword with a decisive motion that seemed to seal the royal decree. Prince Adrian, he said formally, you will report to the military compound at dawn tomorrow to begin your service. Your personal effects will be limited to what a common soldier would possess. Adrian finally seemed to grasp the full weight of what his defiance had cost his family. His mother's stricken expression, the whispered conversations of the nobles around them, the reality that his life as he had known it was ending, all of it crashed down on him like a collapsing wall. For the first time since the confrontation began, tears appeared in his eyes. "Your Majesty," Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly as the magnitude of his situation became clear. "I accept your punishment, but I beg you to reconsider my mother's exile. She bears no responsibility for my words or actions. Her only crime was trying to protect her son." Lady Corinna felt her heart break anew at her son's attempt to shield her from the consequences of his choices. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his arm. "Adrian, no. I share in this burden because we are family. Your father would expect nothing less from me than to stand beside you, regardless of the cost." Queen Katrin watched this display of family loyalty with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. The royal calculus was complex. Mercy could be seen as weakness, but excessive cruelty might create martyrs in opposition that could threaten her reign in ways that simple execution could not. The ballroom had become a theater of human drama, with hundreds of nobles watching a family's destruction play out before their eyes. Many of them would remember this night for years to come, telling their children about the young prince who chose pride over survival and the queen who chose measured justice over royal vengeance. 3 years later, the same ballroom that had witnessed Adrian's downfall was once again filled with nobles celebrating Queen Katrin's birthday. But this time, Lady Corinna stood among them wearing a simple gray dress that reflected both her reduced circumstances and her quiet dignity. Her exile had ended 6 months earlier when Adrian completed his military service with unexpected distinction, earning the respect of his commanding officers and the grudging admiration of his fellow soldiers. The young man who approached the throne that night bore little resemblance to the angry, grief-stricken boy who had defied the queen years before. Adrian's shoulders were broader now, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his movements carrying the disciplined precision of a seasoned soldier. The pride was still there, but it had been tempered by experience, loss, and hard-won wisdom about the true cost of rebellion. When Adrian's name was called for the formal presentation, the ballroom fell silent with memories of that terrible night. Lady Corinna held her breath, praying that her son had learned the lessons that 3 years of exile had been meant to teach him. She had watched him change during their brief visits, seeing the boy gradually replaced by a man who understood that honor could sometimes require bending without breaking. Adrian walked across the marble floor with steady steps, his military bearing evident in every movement. He wore the simple uniform of a royal guard, having been offered a position in the palace guard upon completion of his service. The offer itself was a form of royal mercy, a recognition that his punishment had served its purpose in humbling him while preserving his usefulness to the crown. When he reached the traditional position 3 feet from the throne, Adrian paused for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Lady Corinna could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he wrestled with the same pride that had nearly destroyed him. But this time, wisdom won over stubborn defiance. Slowly, with deliberate grace, Adrian knelt on one knee and lowered his head in a perfect bow of submission. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "I humbly request the honor of serving the crown with loyalty and dedication, having learned through hardship the value of both duty and humility." The relief that washed over Lady Corinna was so intense that she nearly collapsed. Her son had finally learned the lesson that his father had tried to teach him through example, that true strength sometimes required yielding to forces greater than oneself. The boy who had chosen destruction over submission had become a man who understood that survival and service could coexist with honor. Queen Katrin studied Adrian for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of the rebellious spirit that had once threatened her authority. What she saw seemed to satisfy her because her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Rise, Captain Adrian," she said, using the military rank he had earned through his service. "Your request is granted. Your titles and lands are hereby restored, along with your family's position at court." The announcement sent waves of surprise through the assembled nobles, many of whom had assumed that Adrian's disgrace would be permanent. Lady Corinna felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she watched her son rise to his feet, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and relief that made him look younger than his 19 years. Captain Garrett, now grayer but still formidable, stepped forward with a smile that transformed his usually stern features. "Welcome back, Prince Adrian," he said formally, then added in a lower voice meant only for the young man, "Your father would be proud of the soldier you have become." The words hit Adrian like a physical blow, and for a moment his composure cracked to reveal the emotional young man beneath the disciplined exterior. He nodded silently to the captain, unable to trust his voice with the gratitude he felt for those simple words of validation. As the formal ceremony concluded, and the celebration resumed, mother and son found themselves standing together near the same marble columns where Lady Corinna had first spotted Adrian on that fateful night. The parallels were obvious, but the differences were even more profound. Was it worth it? Lady Corinna asked softly, studying her son's face in the chandelier light. She was thinking of all they had lost and gained during those 3 terrible years of exile and uncertainty. Adrian considered the question seriously before answering. "Father always said that some lessons can only be learned through suffering," he replied quietly. "I hated him for saying that when I was young, but I understand now what he meant. I needed to lose everything to understand what really mattered." Around them, the celebration continued with music and laughter, but for Lady Corinna and Adrian, the evening felt like a rebirth. They had survived the consequences of pride and grief, emerging wounded but wiser from an ordeal that had tested every aspect of their character. The young prince who had refused to bow had become a man who understood that true nobility lay not in defiance, but in the courage to serve something greater than oneself. Queen Katrin watched them from her throne, her expression thoughtful as she observed the reunion of the family she had nearly destroyed. Perhaps she too had learned something from the events of 3 years ago, that mercy and justice could sometimes achieve more than fear and punishment alone. The kingdom was stronger when its nobles learned wisdom through experience rather than meeting their end through royal wrath.